Good afternoon, Dr. Robert Turner II. Thank you for making the time to share your journey with us for the Black Male Professors and Researchers Collective Professors Interview Series. And I really appreciate the fact that specifically since you are working on a grant right now, you took some time off to do this interview. And I will just briefly introduce myself and then pass it over to you to introduce yourself. My name is Donald St. Conserve. I'm an associate professor at George Washington University, where I've had the pleasure of working in the Department of Prevention and Community Health in the School of Public Health. And I'm also the director and founder for the Black Male Professors and Researchers in the Collective Initiative. And today we are conducting our second interview for the series, and I'm going to pass it over to you now, Dr. Turner.
All right. Well, thank you, Donaldson. I really appreciate you having me on. And I'm an assistant professor at the George Washington University in the School of Medicine and Health Sciences. And I'm in the Department of Clinical Research and Leadership. I'm an assistant professor, just been there, just coming up on my 4th year, as a matter of fact. Been quite a good experience there. My background and training is as a medical sociologist. So I have training in mixed methods and particularly with a focus on ethnography and qualitative research, but through a various number of fellowships, postdocs, and additional training, I've been able to really hone in on my statistical skills, my qualitative skills, and work mixed methods research. And what I overall focus on is Black men's brain health across the life course. So really looking at from the time Black men are wind up becoming men at 18, all the way up into older adults, 80, 90s, and from there. And I started my work really wanting to understand the impact of concussions and exposures to concussions, repetitive head impacts, because so many Black men play football. Like myself, I played both on a college and a professional football level. And I wanted to know, well, what does that mean for our risk of memory, cognition, mental health, behavioral health, all of those kinds of things, which has then led me to marry that with or tie it together with doing research on mild cognitive impairment, or what we would say accelerated cognitive aging. And if there's looking at links between concussions and possibly Alzheimer's disease or even related dementias from there.
Wow, I know about your work, but every time I hear you talk about it, I'm very intrigued to learn more, and you are doing wonderful work in that space. And before we focus too much on the work, I would like you to take us back to before you were interested in research. What was your journey like before you even thought about academia as a potential career?
Well, I appreciate you asking that question. As I mentioned, I played professional football, and the transition from college to go to the pros, and then my transition from the professional leagues to life after football was really difficult. It was really, I call it my wilderness years. I lived in California for a little while, moved to Texas, and then came back to New York City. I'm originally from New Jersey, and I had never had any interest whatsoever of going into academia. But I knew that because education was really important in my family. I was the first person to graduate from college in my family. My grandmother showed me how important that was. And then in those transition years, I started businesses. I tried to do a lot of different things, but I could never really find myself. In part, none of that really made me feel as though I was making any kind of contributions or that I was doing anything impactful. Starting businesses, and that was great, and making money, losing money, doing all of the things that entrepreneurs have to do. But I just felt like, man, what am I going to do now? And I just knew that, hey, listen, if the biggest contribution in the world that I made was by the time I was 28 years old and I finished playing professional football, then I'm going to be lost for the rest of the next 60, 70 years that I'm alive. I don't know what else I'm going to do. And a friend in New York City, I was talking about going to graduate school, and she said, you're always talking about race. why don't you go to school for that? And I'd never heard of it. And she said, it's called sociology. And just a way the bunch of series of things worked out, I wanted to go get a master's degree, but it showed that, everything I read online said, well, you can't do very much with a master's degree. So I said, okay, I'll do a PhD. The interesting thing about that whole thing for me was that I was never really, once I finished getting, doing all of the criteria for obtaining the PhD, I was not interested in going on to academia at all, or any kind of scholarship. In fact, I told one of my really good mentors at the time, Juan Battle, I said, I'm not gonna do this. I'm not interested. I want to go do someplace else. I want to make more money. I want to do all these things. And he said to me, he said, what you do, the work that you do, you will get a lot of financial support. People they want to financially support you based on the questions that you're asking. There's a lot that we need to know about Black men's health, and you're well positioned to do that. And he just really wouldn't let me get out of academia, and so that's how I wound up here where I am today.
Wow. I'm learning more about your journey, even though we have been friends for a number of years. I'm curious to learn through this interview, how did you make the transition? I know you said you went in for your master's and then you went for a PhD, but I've also been very intrigued by your journey from finishing your PhD to transitioning to postdoctoral fellowships at different universities, and then eventually securing the position at George Washington University. So if you could also now just highlight a little bit of that journey for us, and then we can potentially move to
Sure. That journey, that was an 8-year journey. That was almost like it was to really studying to recreate myself with a whole nother PhD. When I had a book contract, which was with Oxford University Press, to convert my dissertation into a book manuscript, which was published in 2018 by Oxford University Press. It's called Not for Long: The Life and the Career of the NFL Athlete. And at that time, when I was writing the book, the book is really focused on the struggles that NFL athletes have in their life to after football, which is, again, very much it was really kind of very therapeutic for me to understand why I was making all the decisions and why I had the struggles that I did. And then at that point, I thought, okay, well, here I am. I've done 8 years in graduate school. I'm spending another couple of years writing this book. And I needed to continue to get the support to finish the book done. So the first thing I did was I had a postdoc fellowship at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which, as you know, we both share that experience down there. And I was in exercise and sports science, but a really, really wonderful mentor picked me up and brought me over to the School of Medicine there in the pediatrics department and said, hey, there are all these questions that you are well positioned to answer around sports participation, physical activity, and health. And so we just started working together and got one of those small track grants. And I wrote a couple of papers using some, I think we use NHANES data set. That started me off down that path. And so here I was trying to finish the book, all of a sudden deeply immersing myself more deeply into this world of research and understanding how to ask questions, how to do examinations and those kinds of things. And so through that experience, I reached out to, I actually had a second postdoc that took me to the University of Maryland because of some whole other experiences that I had to focus my book. And kind of have to go back into the field. And so I needed the support financially to go back to the field, to ask some other questions, do more interviews, live with athletes. The book has 140 interviews with it, but I also spent years living in the community, very much like an anthropologist, living amongst athletes themselves and understanding kind of how their wives and their moms and their children, how all family members all experience this journey of going to the NFL together. And so because I needed to go back into the field, and then I also needed additional support, and then all of these things led me to I needed to do additional postdocs. So I did one at UNC, and then I did another one at the University of Maryland, which allowed me to actually finish up and collect all the data that I had. And then at that point, I started to get really have these questions about concussions and depression. And so I contacted Dr. James Jackson, who was at the time the director for the Institute of Research at University of Michigan, and also the director, along with Peter Lichtenberg, at the Michigan Institute for Urban African American Aging Research, MACWAR. And I said, hey, listen, you have a data set that I'd like to be able to work on. And he said, okay, great. You can work on the data set. You can have access to the data set. But what you're going to need to do is write a grant. You're going to need to be able to get a diversity, fellowship for through I forget the name of the thing, but I needed to write a diversity grant, and which was a 2-year supplement basically to his P30 grant. And so I wrote it. And he said, you're going to work directly. Your mentor for this project will be Dr. Keith Whitfield. And the first thing Dr. Whitfield said was, if you're planning to stay in academia at this point, and you're a book writer, you're going to have to learn how to do mixed methods research because you have the qualitative background, but it takes you years to write a book. And he was right. It took me, after the time I graduated from graduate school, it took me another 8 years to finish my book. And he said, you don't have the time in your career as being an older, scholar, older in age, biological age, you don't have the time. You're going to have to learn how to do mixed methods research. And so within that, when I had my diversity, fellowship, and then I had, he said, okay, let's write a KO1 award. And so that I was able to get on because of both of those awards. I was able to be on faculty at Duke for a number of years, and then get the additional training that I need. And I'm going into my 5th year for the KO1 award, which then led me to the position of securing an assistant professor at the George Washington University.
Thank you. I'm going to take us a bit back because you mentioned the comment about Dr. Keith Whitfield mentioning that you don't have the luxury to take all this time because you're an older scholar. So just for context, can you tell us how old you were when you started your master's and your PhD program?
Yeah. So when I went into graduate school at the Graduate Center at CUNY, they had a comprehensive program where you got the master's en route to the PhD. So I didn't have to apply to 2 different programs. I just went straight in, and I started that at 40.
At
40 years old.
Okay.
Right.
So
exactly.
Anyone who's listening, if you don't have a PhD and you're thinking about it and you're a bit, in your 30s, you can still definitely consider the PhD even in your 40s, as Dr. Turner, has gracefully shared with us, and also have a successful career in academia, depending on the kind of opportunities that you are able to take advantage of. So now, I'm glad you mentioned the opportunity. Well, actually, before I ask the next question, just for more clarification, the program, the fellowship at University of North Carolina, was it for 2 years as well?
Yeah.
It was 2 years at University of North Carolina, and then you did 2 years at University of Maryland, or is it longer?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So they have the at the University of North Carolina, it's the oldest running program for postdoc program for people of color. And so I was in that program. It was wonderful experience. Met a bunch of great scholars. Anyone out there who is, in need of a postdoc, thinking about doing one, the North Carolina, that postdoc program really was wonderful for me. And then from there, I went into African American Studies at the University of Maryland. And as I mentioned, there I got some experience teaching, both in African American Studies, but then also cross-listed a class that was in public health. So that was really good. And for me, and the work that I was doing allowed me to write my book, but then also meet a number of athletes that I was able to chronicle their experience and record that for my book as well. So that worked out really, really well. But then to get into the meat of what I'm doing right now, doing aging research, gerontology, doing health disparities research, mixed methods research, and then really being well-versed in training to do cognitive aging and Alzheimer's disease research. All of that came from the 2 different fellowships that I have had through
the one at University of North Carolina, and then the one at University of Maryland.
Well, it really started when I went back to Duke University with Keith Whitfield, because that's where I had the
diversity
I had the diversity supplement and then the K award. So all of those other things really set me up to be very competitive for the diversity fellowship and the or a diversity grant and then the KO1. Because prior to that, I really wasn't doing very much biomedical research. I was doing some health, but doing biomedical, doing all of these different components that I needed to be able to bring together, because I do mixed methods and also multi-method research.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. I have a couple more clarification questions for anyone who may be, watching and want to know exactly what is the name of the fellowship at University of North Carolina that you applied for.
Excuse me. All right, so that's a good one. I think it's the UNC. I have to look it up. It's the UNC. It's the diversity.
Is it the Carolina postdoctoral.
Yeah.
Diversity fellowship. It's like it's supposed to serve as a potential transition to a position at University of North Carolina.
Exactly. So it's their diversity scholars program. Exactly. Yes. And it's out of the provost's office.
And just out of curiosity, when you were finishing your PhD, I'm assuming you may have had to think about multiple postdoctoral opportunities to look for, right? So how did you decide in this one? Did you apply to multiple postdoctoral fellowships?
Yeah, definitely. It really was kind of out of a sense of desperation, to be quite honest with you, because I had this book contract, and I've thought, okay, well, I need to be able to. I've graduated now from graduate school with a Ph.D., but I have this book contract, and they gave me an advance for the book contract. But I didn't go on the job market, so I didn't have a job. So I didn't have the luxury of working in academia, so that way I can finish the book manuscript. So that meant that I needed to have a postdoc, or I was going to have to go out and get a regular job and figure out how to continue to write this manuscript along the way. I just felt that, or I needed to keep really close to academia if I was going to write a book that was on an academic press, right? And in my instance, it needed to really be a crossover because it was supposed to be out in the public as well as in academia. So that's where I really needed to have that support. So I probably applied for maybe 10 or more postdocs. And that was a really difficult time, because if people can remember, they can think back to this, but I graduated on the heels in 2010, but it was very much on the heels of the housing bubble, crashing in 2007, 2008. So the job market was really, constricted. There were not many tenure track positions that were available at that time. Funding for postdoc positions really was drying up. So we were all scrambling, or at least myself and some others who didn't get jobs. We were scrambling to try to find anything. And so it just so happens that Dr. Deborah Strollman at UNC, she saw my application and really championed it for me to push it through. But I also had another opportunity at Rice through it's kind of a diversity program that they had. And one of the mentors of that program called me up and said, hey, we really like your application. We'd really like you consider to come here to Rice. The problem is with us is we're probably not going to meet as a committee for another month. And at that time, I had just received an opportunity to go to Chapel Hill. And I thought, I was almost very short-sighted, as a matter of fact. I thought, well, at that time, Rice was paying $50,000 for a fellowship, right? For me to go for a two-year postdoc. Then, of course, that was living in Houston, where it was a little higher cost of living. And at the time, UNC was paying about $36,000. And I had this mentality. I was living in Brooklyn, New York at that time, and I was like, listen, I've already been broke as a grad student trying to make it in New York. I can't live on $36,000, and I can't go take this thing at UNC. But a very good friend said to me, she said, listen, UNC is an excellent institution. You get great training. And once it's on your CV, you kind of have that halo effect. You can't turn down UNC. So you have to take it. So everything lined up for me. And I went down there, and then that opened the door for me to do all these other things.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the salary for the different postdoctoral opportunities you could have had, especially the one you ended up choosing, even though it was much lower than the opportunity in Houston. because I think a lot of people do not want to do a postdoc because of the lower salary that some of these institutions pay. And I'm also glad you mentioned the reputation of UNC, because I was told the same thing, because I also participated in a fellowship, a postdoctoral fellowship at UNC, and one of the comments someone mentioned was the reputation of the institution. Once you are able to secure any opportunity at UNC, then it will open up doors for you in the future. So it's interesting that you also heard the same thing. So now moving on from UNC, you completed your postdoc, and then you applied for a postdoc at University of Maryland. Was that another diversity postdoctoral fellowship, or was this a different program?
No, that wasn't a diversity one, but I will say that it was in the school of, like I said, it's African American Studies, right? And so that was one of those situations where I don't think they were exclusively looking for people of color, but it just so happened that it was two people who received the fellowships, myself and another brother named Dr. Chris St. Ville. And so that one was quite different than UNC, that postdoc, primarily because they wanted to make sure that you had some teaching experience within that. And they were trying to prepare you to make sure that you were ready for, it was a less structured program in one respect, but it was also quite structured to make sure that you had on your CV that you were really able to develop a course and to teach the course all the way through. So in that 2-year postdoc, I taught two different classes. One in African American Studies, and the second one was, as I mentioned to you before, cross-listed with public health. And so that was a great experience in the fact that it helped me better understand what it meant to read a lot of literature in public health, as well as in health sciences and medical science, and then being exposed to students who wanted to, perform in those areas and study in those areas. And that was kind of a place that I found my home, that I thought, okay, here's the work that I really want to do, having been trained as a sociologist and not really wanting to do traditional sociological work. It really allowed me to understand how I could make a contribution as a medical sociologist, how I could, again, this was before mixed methods, but how what I could bring to the table could help answer some important questions. Because for me, I'm really interested in kind of translational science, science implementation, stuff that really has some means or a way or approach that is looking to kind of help people. What can be done with the work where we can find solutions that can somehow or another be implemented to solution-based work with populations.
All right. So the second fellowship really, as you mentioned, help you to hone in on what you would now start to develop your research trajectory, your research program in. And now we can talk about a diversity supplement. And I think the next few minutes will really focus on grant writing, especially NIH grant writing, because as scholars move from the PhD program in different fields, a lot of scholars have to consider, okay, a postdoctoral fellowship or just going into academia. And you clearly chose the postdoctoral fellowship route for multiple reasons, and it worked out for you, even though the salary may not have been what you would have liked. And the next question I have is, you are now at University of Maryland, in your journey, you decide to reach out to Dr. James Jackson, is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
How did you decide to reach out to him? Did you not have any fears that maybe he would not respond? And why Dr. James Jackson as opposed to another professor at other universities?
Well, at this time, my career was really floundering. I felt as though, in a lot of respects, the training that I received in graduate school, although it was excellent training, especially to be an ethnographer, it didn't prepare me personally to be competitive on the job market. One of those reasons is not about the university, but one of the reasons behind that was that I never intended to go into academia. I was working full time while I was in graduate school. So I was just trying to do this project and then basically leave from there. I went to school just because I wanted to learn this information. I just wanted to learn how to think. And so from there, when it came time to actually being competitive for postdocs, competitive for grants, writing papers. I was learning how to write this book manuscript, but I didn't even know how to write, peer-reviewed journal articles. So I was at a real deficiency. I was really not in a place where I was competitive against many other scholars, so to speak. And but one thing that I will say for Dr. Jackson and others in the Michigan Mafia, as we call it, and all, and same with Keith Whitfield, they saw potential in me, and they understood that my story was like a lot of other people of color, where you're smart, you have a lot of good questions, you just haven't had the training and the mentorship in order to make yourself become very competitive in this other kind of world. And that's what I needed. So I was very nervous as to reaching out to Dr. Jackson. I didn't know him. Another colleague said, "Hey, I actually know him well. I'm in his lab. I got a postdoc with him now. I'll be happy to reach out to you and set up a thing." And so when he set up a phone call, I mean, I was like, "Oh my goodness," I was really nervous and the whole bit, and rightfully so. I mean, the man is just, unfortunately, we lost him a couple of years ago, but his career was just so unbelievable, so many of the things that he's done. And I said, I contacted him. I said, "I know about this data set. And I'd really like to work with it." And I think he really took to the fact that I had the book coming out, that I had played football. So he thought, okay, well, you're a person that I can trust with this data. You understand it. You're asking the kind of questions that I'd really like to see someone dig into to this data with. And that data, they had been sitting on that data for about 8 years and never released it to anyone. And one of the reasons that they were willing to release it to me was because it was very controversial at the time. That was the very first study where one of the co-PIs, David Ware, was called into Congress and asked to testify about the percentage of people who said that they had been self-reported diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, having had, concussions. And so therefore, people had lots of agendas to do something with that data. And he said, okay, listen, if we can really define what it is that you want to do, and we can get the funding for this, then you can be in my fellowship program, because what you're going to need is you're going to need training. You don't just need access to that data. You really need training. You need career development. You need training. This needs to be the first step in this journey. And so they taught me how to ask a question. When I was asking what I want to do with the data, tell him what, he was like, whoa, that's too big. That's too big. You really need focus. He saw in me what we all need, especially people of color who are first generation and don't have a lot of background in doing all of this stuff, or maybe just didn't get quite the polish that you needed to be the scholar that you need. He saw in me something. He saw what I need, and he said, "You need to be in this fellowship." And that's why he brought me into the Muckwar program, and put me directly with Dr. Keith Whitfield, who, by the way, when I was writing that grant, every 2 weeks for the first year we met, and he told me to go and write this component of the grant and then come back and he'll read it and then he'll talk me through this. He helped me understand what kind of scholar that I wanted to be, could be, and how to really think in an academic, scholarly way, in a biomedical way, to do this kind of research. And that really set, the whole pathway for where I am today.
That sounds amazing, especially the opportunity you had to speak with Dr. James Jackson and him kind of helping you to slow down, even though you've had your PhD and 2 postdoctoral fellowships for 4 years now, right? But he still, wanted you to get more training. And I can imagine some people thinking, I mean, after a PhD and 4 years of a fellowship, someone may not want to get more training. They just may want to have a career and have money to support their lifestyle and their family. But you responded in a positive way, because not everyone would say, I want to go for another 2 years or more of training. So I wonder, when you, even though this is this was a great opportunity, but when you heard that you needed the more training, what came to your mind? Like, were you thinking, okay, great, I'll do more training? Or did you have some concerns about more training? Like, when will the training stop? When will you stop needing training? Right?
That's a good question. My biggest concern through that whole process was, here I am. I was at that point in time, I had graduated with a PhD at 2010, and here we are, 2014. And or probably at that time, it was probably 2013, where they're like, okay, you're going to have to write this grant and da 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 da. Right. So I'm like, oh man, one thing I can't do on my CV is I cannot afford to show that there are 3 postdocs on my CV. I said that's because people will ask all kinds of questions like, well, like, when are you going to be ready for the job market? Like, why should we take, you've been out of the jobs that long? Like, who is this guy, right? And how do you tell a story about why you've done 3 postdocs? So I just didn't think that I was going to be able to do that. So what I did was I said to Keith Whitfield, Dr. Whitfield at the time, I said, hey, listen, if I get this diversity fellowship, what I really, really want at this point in my career is I want to be on faculty at Duke. And he said, okay, well, great, let me work that out. And so he got me a research faculty position that wasn't quote unquote predicated on me getting the diversity fellowship, but I was able to self-fund my way through that position at Duke, which was a very critical move on my part, because by that time, when I did go out on the job market, I had done 2 fellowships. I had I had the diversity scholars program that from NIH being funded by the diversity program already at that point. And then I was writing a KO1 award, and ultimately I received that award. So by the time I went to the job market, I was already in a faculty position at Duke with all of this behind me. So it actually really all worked to my advantage to be able to do what I needed to do.
Wow. Yes, that makes sense. You have to advocate for yourself. You have to think about, okay, here I am at a crossroad, right? You had an opportunity to maybe have it listed as another postdoctoral fellowship, but you decided to advocate for yourself. And I'm assuming that came with the experience that you had, throughout those 4 years, to think about how best to position yourself for an academic position. And just to clarify, Dr. Jackson was at University of Michigan, but your mentor, Dr. Keith Whitfield, was at Duke University, and that's how you were able to ask for the position at Duke as opposed to University of Michigan.
That's correct. And so Dr. Whitfield was on the Oversight and Planning Committee for the Michigan Center for Urban African American Aging Research. And he had a very strong relationship with Dr. Jackson. And so he said, hey, listen, and Dr. Jackson was running the institute, right? And so he wasn't in a position where he could take another direct mentor, trainee that could work with him. So he had worked it out with Dr. Whitfield. And as I mentioned, I had already had that relationship and knew North Carolina very well. So it was a natural fit for me to be able to go to Duke to be able to do that. So I was really just blessed beyond belief that I had these 2 powerful men that were well trained and understood, and they saw me. And so I would just say this is that I think in part, they understood where I was. I call it again. I was really kind of didn't know where I was at. They saw and they understood. They understood what was specifically needed, both in terms of my training, but my career development. They took me under their wings as Black men, looking at me as a Black man and saying, okay, here's what you're going to need. Now, that's to say that they have other people of color that they take in, but they really understood where, how the market was looking at me as a Black man and what I needed to do and how positioned I needed to be in order to be competitive for grants and to be able to work in the space that I'm working in.
Yes, and this really reminds me of the last interview we did for the Black Male Professors Initiative. One of the key recommendations the interviews had was the need to have great mentors and reaching out and being excellent, right? So when you do reach out to these individuals who you are asking to work and mentor you, you also yourself have to present yourself as a person they want to invest in. So delivering on what is asked of you and having a professional approach to all of those things, and then for them to see the potential and help you to get to that next stage. And now, talking about next stage, I want us to just really start talking about the grant writing. So a diversity supplement, you mentioned it, but maybe some individuals don't know what it is. So we'll maybe spend a few minutes describing what is a diversity supplement based on your experience.
So the NIH, and in particular, my funding has come through the National Institute of Aging, but there is a, I guess, an effort on their part to help a pipeline program to identify scholars, people of color, people from backgrounds that I have, and so in the diversity supplement is allows you, there's a number of different supplements that you can, like administrative supplement, other types of supplements you can write on a grant, an R level or a P level grant, which is, more of the larger institutional kind of level grant. And so the diversity supplement, that grant, essentially is, it can be, if I'm not mistaken, it can be as short as a year. It can be up to 3 years, and it can actually support people in high school, graduate school, master's program, Ph.D. program. You can be supported as a medical doctor. You can be supported anywhere along your career. And what it essentially is in one respect, it has to contribute to the primary grant in some way, build upon the primary grant to make contributions scientifically. So that's the one thing. So there's a scientific component to this as to what you're actually going to be studying. But then there's a training component. And in my instance, I needed to understand how to do, I didn't know anything about aging research, right? And I also didn't know how to do anything about mixed methods research, right? So those were the two primary elements that I needed to learn in my diversity supplement. We say, okay, great. What does it mean to do aging research? To find out if I want to be an aging research scholar. And then two, how to build on my qualitative background to start being able to work with data. And so that was that research project where when I spoke to Dr. Jackson and I said, can I have access to this data? And it was the NFL Players Care Association data to be able to do some, look at some epidemiological kind of research. And so that's what it gave me the training to be able to do. Those were the two main aims that I needed to do for that particular grant. And another component of this is so important is that you're doing the research, you're doing the training, but the other part that is so critical that people, I think, forget sometimes is it also has to have a strong career development, component into the grant. And that career development component helped me focus on and help the mentors focus on what kind of scholar do you want to be? Where do you see yourself once this thing is done? Do you want to be in a teaching university? You want to be a liberal arts university? You want to be in a research one university? Do you want to be in a tenure track? Do you want to be, just a straight research institute? What is it that how do you see yourself? And let us figure out how we can work together to get you to your ultimate goal.
Wonderful. I couldn't help to think about the salary because we've touched on it earlier for your postdoc at UNC, which was, you said, in the 30,000. And I'm assuming, at University of Maryland, it was higher than the 36,000.
It went up to 50,000. So it wasn't a lot more. But again, right, DC is more expensive. So yeah, so there was significant financial kind of, I guess you would say, sacrifice in order to go back and get all of this new training and career development.
So then at University of Maryland, you went up to 50,000, but now the diversity supplement, did it remain at 50, or how were you able to write in the salary? Because if I remember correctly, for diversity supplement, there might be a cap that the National Institute of Health has, or is that negotiable between you and the institution?
So I think we should probably have a whole nother discussion on that. But essentially, universities, like the supplement didn't have a cap to it, which is interesting. The K01 has a cap to it, right, which I got afterwards. So the supplement, you could basically whatever the salary was that you have. I think what they did, I can't quite remember, but anyway, my salary went up to $75,000 on the supplement. And so just slowly it was starting to go up. But then you also have the ability to negotiate with either the center, your mentor, the school, the department, that they can also top off your salary. right? So they can say, let's say for instance, it was $75,000. That's what the NIH is going to pay you. Your department could pay you another $50,000 on top of that. So you can negotiate kind of where you are in your career. Again, if you are moving from an area that's more rural in a college town and you're moving to an expensive city, or you have a family, you have young children at home, or all of these other things, you can negotiate once they decide that this is where, kind of you are. A good solid postdoc program will do what they have to do, or a development program or fellowship or a grant. They'll try to do whatever they can to make sure that you, especially for people of color, because they're trying to develop this pipeline, we have certain needs that have to be met. And so you have to be willing to speak out on that and advocate for yourself, as you have said.
Perfect. Well, I'm learning as well, because I didn't know about those different options for the diversity supplement of having, not having a cap at the NIH, but then having the ability to actually have the department, or ask the department, advocate for yourself to try to have a higher salary. So this, I'm hoping, is helpful for anyone who may be thinking about a diversity supplement. And just to be transparent, I applied for a diversity supplement when I was finishing my Ph.D. program to help support my postdoctoral fellowship at University of North Carolina. But unfortunately, I was not awarded the diversity supplement. And thankfully, I knew that I did not want to rely on just the diversity supplement. So right after I submitted the diversity supplement application with my mentor, I asked her kindly if she would look for another opportunity that could provide the funding for me to come to University of North Carolina. And that's how I was able to go there through T32 fellowship, which is another mechanism that provides funding for different students, maybe at the PhD level or at the postdoctoral fellowship, or even I think in undergrads, there are also some T32 fellowships, which may include the Minority Access to Research career, which I was a part of when I was in undergrad. But the T32 at University of North Carolina was able to support me for 3 years for the postdoctoral fellowship there, and that's how I was able to go. So you are awarded your diversity supplement, right? So it's not everyone who applies for them receives them, but you did. And I'm wondering if you can just highlight a little bit of what the writing process was, for the diversity supplement. I'm assuming this was probably the biggest grant you had to kind of apply for, even though it's a supplement within a larger grant. But how much work did it take from you and feedback from your mentors? How long did it take? Like how many months did it take, or weeks if it was, shorter? And then we can wrap
yeah. I mean, it took a long time. I mean, because again, I hadn't written a grant before. I had this small grant, the tracks grant at UNC, but I had never really written one before. But what Dr. Jackson did was, obviously he gave me a template and said, here, follow this. And then what also, as I mentioned to you before, I was working directly every week with Dr. Jackson. I mean, Dr. Whitfield. So so for me, what was the biggest part of the grant process was writing the aims page. And I tell everybody that you really need to spend about 6 weeks on your aims. It takes a lot of time thinking through, because that tells you what the project is really all about. And then from there, the story unfolds from the aims page, right? So the aims page is what you want to do. And the rest of the grant is why that project is important. Like, why does it need to be supported? And you talk about the innovation, you talked about the significance of it. All of those things have to come, and then the approach to it, right? You write the approach, but all of that starts from the aims page. And then what has to happen is, for me at least, I think it's really important to talk through this with people, know what your ideas are, and then keep reading and rereading the project that you want to do to make sure it's very clear in your mind. Because I'm writing a grant right now, as I mentioned to you before, and I realized that about 2 days ago, I realized that I need to go back and reread this, because when I'm writing, although technically it's good, I'm not sure if I'm excited about it yet, because I'm not sure if the story is there yet. once the story is there, then I get really excited about the grant. So, yeah, it's the one great thing about writing a diversity supplement is it's so early in your career that you don't have these other external kind of pressures on you to do other things. But once you start to write grants and, like you're successful, I have 3 different grants that I'm piloting right now, and I'm trying to get those grants I'm running those grants. I have a lab, and then I have to pull back and write. So here I am today over the holidays. I use that focused time to just do a lot of writing. So yeah, you have to give yourself as much time as you need to be able to have the story very clear in your mind, and then be able to make sure that what you put on paper translates, what was up here goes down on that paper very well. And then hope and make sure that other people, when they read it, they understand exactly the way you have presented it.
Perfect. And again, I'm going to focus just on the diversity supplement and bring you back for another interview about all the other grants that you have and all the amazing projects, because this would be too long to do in one interview. But when you were writing the diversity supplement, were you still at University of Maryland? So were you supported by University of Maryland Fellowship and then working on the diversity supplement? Or
Yeah, absolutely. So what I did was my primary objectives at the University of Maryland was to finish my book and to secure this diversity supplement. So I was not, I did put some jobs out on the job market, but it wasn't, what was clear to me was that I did not want to go into a traditional sociology department, which I had been trained. And so therefore it was pretty obvious that I would not be competitive to go to a school of public health or some other interdisciplinary program at the moment. My CV didn't look the way that it needed to. My CV had a book on it, and that was basically it, maybe one or 2 papers, but didn't have a lot. And so I really kind of was almost put all my eggs in the basket, where fortunately it worked out for me to get the Diversity Fellowship. But I kind of just felt that given the training and the real the support that I had, it was kind of all or nothing. But I'd gotten a really good score from it before. I had to resubmit, but my score was really good, and it was, I was convinced by that time by Dr. Jackson and Dr. Whitfield that I would just, it was such great comments that I could address all of those, and then I'd be very competitive for it coming through.
So you had to resubmit your diversity supplement.
Yeah, I did.
Okay. So you did it. I didn't even know that the diversity supplements were scored. I thought because of the nature of the way they are reviewed that they were not scored. But it's also good to know.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't even know if it was a score, but you get the comments back, you get the sheets back, and then you have to respond back to that. And so it was very, it was like, okay, I know what's going to happen here. We can see.
And is there a deadline, or it's based on when you have it ready? Because I know that. I don't think I know how the deadlines work per se.
Yeah, there are no deadlines. They what happens is they're reviewed internally, at least in the NIA. I don't know about other centers or institutes within NIH, but in NIA they review them every quarter, right? So you can submit it at any time during the quarter, and I think it's probably 2 weeks or so before the end of the quarter to make sure that you get on the docket for them to review. And so the whole thing, it generally for a diversity supplement, I would say, especially if you have to resubmit it, you gotta really plan out that it's going to take about 9 months for it to get funded. If you're really good, it's going to get funded even if it gets funded in the first, within that quarter, it still has to go to, it gets approved, but then it has to go to council, and then it has to, the budgeting has to happen. So at the very minimum, it's like 6 months from when you put it in. And if you have to resubmit, you give yourself a little bit more time, and it's about 9 months. So that's the way that happens.
Perfect. Well, I want to thank you for making the time again. I know you're writing a grant. What grant are you working on now? Is it a R1?
It's an R1. Yes, I'm working on an R1. It's looking at Black men both men who have played football on any level, all level of football, and men who have not, Black men that have not had exposure to traumatic brain injury or repetitive head impacts. And we're trying to understand what explains the Black men altogether have had lower test scores or cognitive and neuropsychiatric test scores. And so we're trying to understand what explains those, the lower scores, the diversity, disparity within that. And we're taking an approach to look at the social determinants of health and see if we can understand if we can identify the measures that actually, have a direct relationship on the outcomes that we're looking at.
Wow. Well, I'm sure it's going to be a great project, and I hope, I don't want to say anything about whether it's going to get funded or not, but I know it's a process to get the grant together, having a team and making sure that you submit a strong application. So before you go, I would like to give you a chance to also highlight the exciting conference, the grant that you received from the National Institute of Health to put together this great training program for scholars who are interested in the work that the program is funded for. So just take a few minutes to give some information about the program, where people can apply, because I know you're also recruiting mentees maybe throughout the years. I know you already have a cohort, so please.
Yes. So the conference, we have an R13 grant from the National Institute of Aging, which allows us to host a conference for the next 3 years during the Super Bowl week. And this year it's supposed to be in person. We don't know what's happening right now with Omicron. I have to get back together with the other co-PIs actually tomorrow, or by the time people start to see this. We may be in person, we may have a hybrid model, or we may have to take the whole thing virtually. But people can go online to our website, menshealth.org, and you can see it's a 2-day conference where our whole kind of the legs that we look at is we want to teach people how to do community-based participatory research grounded in the health disparities research framework that was developed by the National Institute of Aging. So in other words, if you're going to work with a population, in our instance, this is for Black men's brain health and risk and resilience factors around brain health for Black men. And Black men, as you well know, are an at-risk population for, all types of health disparities. And so how do you do culturally competent and culturally sensitive work in that arena that is able to identify the biomedical risk and resilience factors to your health outcomes? And so we come together, and that's what the whole focus of the conference is. But then what you had mentioned earlier is we have an emerging scholars program, of which we identify 9 or 10 scholars a year annually. Our first cohort was just selected, really, really excited about them. You're serving as one of the mentors for that program. And again, that's a 15-month program that does, based on basically what my experiences were with the Mockmore program, is how do you help early career scholars, or in our instance, we even work with mid-career scholars, someone who, let's say, for instance, you have a track record of doing research in the health space, but you have not done work and you want to move into the space doing Black male cognitive and brain health research, and you haven't done community-based participatory research. So we'll take anyone within, who said that we want to do that. And we will then pair you up with mentors, and we support you. You come to 2 conferences and we support you. We have some small amount of money to support you to do a pilot project, and we're very happy to be funded by the Alzheimer's Association as well as the National Institute on Aging. And so we'd love it if you can attend the conference in person if we're going to do that, and if not, then you'll have to keep an eye open to see if whether we're doing a hybrid or virtual model. And as I mentioned to you, go to the website mensbrainhealth.org. I'll just say that again, mensbrainhealth.org, or you can come to my own personal website, which is robertturnerphd.com, and you'll find out all the information there. And I'd love to answer and get people involved with this in any way possible.
Man, I couldn't help to feel or to imagine the excitement you have to be able to now pay it forward, right? After you have been invested in by those mentors, Dr. James Jackson, Dr. Keith Whitfield, who took you from the stage where you were with your PhD to help you make this transition to now becoming an assistant professor, successful professor with multiple grants, multiple collaborations at different universities, and then to put in the time to apply for a grant specifically to now train younger, or not even younger, but early or mid-career researchers. And I can only imagine how exciting it is. I'm sure it takes a lot of work. I remember when you were working on that grant, but for it to have been, reviewed and scored and funded, and now you can have it for the next 3 years, it just shows that it may have taken you a while to get to where you are, but now that you've been in that position for what? You said you're going for the 4th year?
Yeah, I'm just starting my 4th year. Yeah. Absolutely.
So you took the time to focus on writing another grant just to train other individuals who can eventually go back into the field and do the same thing that we are doing, right? Moving
Absolutely.
Field forward and increasing the number of successful Black scholars and underrepresented scholars. So it's very exciting to learn more about your work and your journey. And as I mentioned, I will have you for another interview whenever time allows, so that we can just focus on the number of projects that you are working on and the impact you are having in the space as a scholar and a leader in the field. So on that note, if you don't have anything else to say, I'll just say goodbye and tune in for next time. And please subscribe, if you're watching, subscribe to the channel so you can be alerted when we post future interviews, with Dr. Turner and other great Black male professors and researchers in the field. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure.